I'm back with Dr. Neil Frank, former director of the National Hurricane Center, and we want to talk about hurricanes.
Right.
But let's start at the most basic level. What is a hurricane?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's got winds of 75 miles an hour or something, Hurricanes, it's interesting that hurricanes are not freak accidents of nature that are designed to inflict damage on human beings and the coastal areas. They have a very useful function. In the atmosphere, you have cold air in the polar regions and warm air in the tropical regions. Now, in order to have a planet that lives on, we have to mix this up. The winter storm is the primary way that that's happened. Now, in the summertime, when the boundary between the cold air and the warm air moves into higher latitudes, here's this big tropical area, and the heat is just perking away. Well, a hurricane is a bubble of hot air.
I see.
And when that hurricane moves into higher latitude, it removes heat from the tropics, and it makes it tolerable for us to live.
Now, you told us that when you were at the Hurricane Center, you noticed that many people, even on the coast, the coast of the East Coast of America, Florida, the Texas coast, had never experienced a hurricane. And so you said, look, we're trying to develop all this new technology, and that's cool, but we need to educate people about what a hurricane is. And that was a lot of what you did.
That's right.
Was educate people about how lethal these hurricanes can be and how homes should be constructed and so on. Let's bring this back to the global warming, the climate change debate, because the argument, as I understand it, is that the reason we're seeing a surge of hurricanes and more, not just more hurricanes, but more vicious, destructive hurricanes is due to man-made climate change. Now, here we have a graph we're going to take a good look at, and you're going to tell us what it means.
First of all, let me tell you that the reason we're being told that is because the activists are saying their numerical models show that. But the data doesn't support what they're saying.
Okay, so let's be clear you're saying that they're claiming that there are more hurricanes, not because there are actually more hurricanes, but because their models predict more hurricanes.
Exactly.
I see.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're not counting the hurricanes. No. They're just guessing based upon a model.
And so we have a hurricane. That's global warming.
Right. So now let's look at actual hurricanes.
Now, in terms of the Atlantic, I think the only realistic way of determining the number, whether there's been an increase in hurricanes or not, is to look at the landfall of major hurricanes. Now, a major hurricane would be the category 3, 4, 5, or winds in excess of 150 miles an hour. So let's start on the left-hand side, 1850, and by decade, you can see the number of major hurricanes that have made landfall in the United States.
Okay, let me just explain. So these are from 1850 to the present. We're going decade by decade, and we're counting major hurricanes, and each of these graphs represents the number of major hurricanes in that decade.
That made landfall. In the lower 48.
Yes.
We're not talking about hurricanes in the Eastern Atlantic or someplace. That's a big question. So I would concede to you that in 1880, a tropical storm might have made landfall in a remote area and it wouldn't have been recorded. But I can almost assure you that if it had winds of 110 miles an hour, it's in here. So this is the number of major hurricanes that made landfall in the lower 48 by decades. Well, you can see the trend is downward. And particularly since the 40s and the 50s. Florida got hit by 7 hurricanes in the 40s, and the Carolinas got hit by 6 hurricanes in the 50s. So there has been a downward trend. And there's been in other words, what I'm telling you, there's no evidence from the data to suggest that there's been an increase.
And so it seems like hurricane levels are reasonably flat from the 1850s to the 1950s of almost a century, a little bit up, a little bit down. But then there's been a kind of decline so that it's pretty clear that let's say between 2000 and 2020, a lot fewer hurricanes than, let's say, between 1940 and 1960.
And that would be landfalling storms now, okay?
Yes, exactly.
Because when we look in the Atlantic, you're getting a different picture. Oh, we're seeing a lot more hurricanes out there. But this graph only shows the trend for landfalling hurricanes in the lower 48.
Let's look at another graph. This would be graph number 6.
Right.
And here we're gonna look at. Well, this is a graph that covers hurricanes and storms.
And storms. The hurricanes would be the red, and the storms would be in the yellow from 1850 all the way over to 2015.
Okay.
All right. Well, there has been an increase in the number of storms. There's no question about it. Particularly the yellows. We're a lot of tropical storms. We're naming a lot more than we did back in the 1800s. We didn't have any way of noting some of these weak storms back at that time. And you'll notice that there is a trend up and down, up and down. There's a 60-year cycle in the Earth's temperature that is reflected in the hurricane activity. So we had 30 years when we have warming, then we have 30 years when we have cooling, you have 30 years when you have warming. Now let's look at the hurricanes starting over here in 1850.
Well, just pause for a second, because it looks to me like on the longer scale, far from seeing a kind of constant warming, we're seeing a cyclical pattern, hotter, cooler, hotter, cooler.
Right.
And part of what I think you're saying is that what the climate change activists are doing is taking one of these periods, namely the 80s and 90s,
right here,
pretending like that is normal, that's been going on constantly and will go on, and the distortion comes right there. And then here, I think what you're saying, and tell me if I'm right about this, I see that satellites come into play when?
Oh, in the late 60s, in the 70s. Let's say in the 70s. Now, the activists like to start their graphs here in 1970. Well, we were in this cold period. Remember we talked about the cold period? Well, that ended in 1975. And then we went back into an active period. So if you look at the hurricanes from in the 70s, then we went into an active period. The Earth was warming, and so we saw an increase in active. It had nothing to do with carbon dioxide.
Now, part of what I think, isn't it also a fact that our measurements have gotten better?
Yes.
So we can count. I mean, you talked about how when we met, you were talking about how there are hurricanes out at sea.
That's right.
And in the past, we wouldn't even have any idea about them, let alone name them.
That's right.
So there's been an increase in counting due to technology, an increase in naming. I think you said that we now kind of name everything, right?
Absolutely.
Even if a hurricane doesn't even come to America, the American authorities are naming it.
We named one last year just before it made landfall in Portugal. Now, this is a key point, satellites. Take a look here. See, we're seeing an increase. Well, we're seeing an increase because a lot of these storms are in the eastern Atlantic.
Oh, I see.
Okay. If you go back to 1933, in the eastern Atlantic, we had 21 named storms that year. It was until 2020 and 2025, it was the most active hurricane period in the record. And I mean, the tropics were boiling, right? I've drawn a vertical line here. This would be the eastward extent that reconnaissance planes could go out. So back in this time, we would send a reconnaissance plane out every day from Puerto Rico. We didn't know what was happening over here in the eastern. Look at that. 1933, we did 21 named storms. Nothing was recorded in the eastern Atlantic. And yet 2005, when we had 28 storms, we had 7 registered over here. So satellite pictures have had a big impact on the number of storms we see here. And you remember in the previous graph, we saw a lot more of the tropical storms, the yellow ones, in this period of time. Well, that's because we're seeing things out here. And the other thing is in the North Atlantic, we are naming things now that we did not name before we had satellites.
Well, I mean, the remarkable conclusion for me is that this is not necessarily a change in the number of events.
That's right.
But a change in the level of human knowledge.
That's right.
Not to mention a change in the nomenclature, the act of naming these. Right. And so it's almost like, you have a number of species, right? And let's say in the old days, people only knew that there were 4,000 species. Right. Now they go, oh, we've got 80,000 species because we've named them all. And it's not because the number of species on the earth has increased by 15-fold. Right. It's just that we are now counting things that we didn't count before. Right. And so we have the illusion that the actual events are increasing. Actually, it's only our knowledge that's increasing. We'll be right back.